All right, thanks very much. Thanks, Nelly, for your wonderful words. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the two women who work behind the scene. Of course, Oshie, you did a lot of work to make this event possible. So thanks for all your logistical work. I want to also take this opportunity to thank Reina, who is somewhere in the system, who has done all the registration work and setting up Zoom and everything for us. So thank you for your work. So I'm going to begin the Japanese session. So that it's going to be myself and Taeko presenting two separate and yet interrelated presentations. Taeko is going to focus upon the political side of the thing called EDU-Port Nippon. We call it EDU-Port. And I'm going to talk about ethical implications of EDU-Port for broader discussions around international development and cooperation. And our work are extensively drawing upon the report that we compiled and put together and submitted to the Ministry of Education in March 2021. And I'm going to share the link to the report because I found that it's a bit very difficult to get to this link. Somehow Ministry of Education put this link in a very obscure location in their website. It's almost nearly impossible to get to. So I'm going to share the link with you guys so that, unfortunately, the report is written in Japanese and it's quite voluminous. It's about 280 pages long. But I guess I'm sharing this link with the Japanese readers just in case they might be interested in the work upon which we are making a presentation today. So I'm going to share the link. Over to you, Taeko. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for your kind introduction, everyone. Hello, everyone. Great to meet you. So my name is Taeko Okitsu. I'm a professor at the Otsuma Women's University in Tokyo. And before I begin my talk, let me thank Oshie-san and Reina-san, our colleagues at Tampere University and University of Kyoto for organizing this really exciting event and inviting me to talk. So let me share my slides. Okay, so my presentation today, which is the first half of our joint presentation with Keita, I'll talk about some basic features of EDU-Port Japan and its official objectives and key functions, as well as some important context in which this policy emerged. And by so doing, I will try to illuminate how multiple and seemingly contradictory rationales are simultaneously pursued in EDU-Port, and which were shaped by the complex interplay of global and local forces. So what's EDU-Port Japan? EDU-Port Japan was launched by the Ministry of Education, Culture, Science, and Technology, which is so-called MEXT in Japan in 2016. It's touted as a public-private partnerships to proactively introduce and transfer Japanese style of education overseas, most specifically to the emerging economies and so-called developing countries. It's also touted as a multi-ministerial platform of which not only MEX, but other ministries and government agencies are the members, namely Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA, which is in charge of the Japan's official development assistance, and Japan External Trade Organization, JETRO. So what does EDU-Port Japan try to achieve through this so-called All Japan initiative? These are three official objectives of the EDU-Port. Some wordings have been changed recently, and some word has actually been completely eliminated. But the ones that I'm showing right now is the original ones that are unveiled in 2017. Firstly, it aims at internationalizing Japanese education through internationalizing Japanese curriculum and Japanese people through transnational interactions. It also aims at increasing the number of foreign students coming to study in Japanese universities. So we can say that this is kind of educational and learning rationale. And secondly, it aims at increasing pro-Japanese populations overseas, raising Japan's soft power and international standing, while at the same time addressing global issues such as helping to achieve SDGs and ESD. And thirdly, it aims at contributing to Japanese economic growth by firstly, by expanding Japanese agribusiness operations in overseas market. And secondly, by developing Japanese style human capital needed for Japanese style infrastructure system, such as roads, ports, bridges, to be exported from Japan to the emerging Asian countries. I will come back to this point later. But overall, so EDU-Port tries to achieve these sort of multiple objectives, which are supported by differing rationale and so have some inherent tensions and contradiction, because they represent the interests of the different ministries and different stakeholders. For instance, there's a tension between the conflicting rhetoric of marketization of national education and learning from others through cross-border, cross-national interaction. And also, marketizing one's national education model might clash with the humanist intent to contribute to the interest of the others. Because marketization is essentially about making profits by shaping the interests and preferences of the others. So the claim that marketization of one's education doesn't clash with the interest of the other nation is premised upon the belief that one's national education model is superior to that of the other nations. And in this paradigm, I think Japan's proactive act of proactively sharing it and even setting it, setting the education model overseas is justified because it's seen as a benevolent act of the Japanese government and the private sector together. So how does EDU-Port try to achieve these multiple objectives? There are two main functions of EDU-Port. One is public relations about Japanese education through developing promotional videos and brochures, organizing education fairs, and holding dissemination seminars, and so on. And the other function is pilot projects. Whoever wishes to transfer their education practices overseas can apply for this scheme. And between 2017 to 2020, 66 projects have been selected as pilot projects. And there are a wide range of pilot project beneficiaries. And interestingly, they're not only edubusiness, but they include public and private universities and non-governmental organizations and municipal education board and so on and so forth. So that means transnational interaction under EDU-Port is not just education exports by private business, but also it includes the various other forms of transnational educational interactions, including university cross-border collaboration, international aid and cooperation by various actors, and a very small-scale grassroots education interaction, and sometimes the mixture of all these. The kind of education practices that pilot projects try to achieve also vary greatly, ranging from lesson study, health education, school sports festival, robotics education, to name but a few. And the project activities are predominantly conducted in the emerging economies of Southeast Asia, and with overwhelming numbers centered in Vietnam. But also, you can find a project in other regions and countries as well. I think there are some issues related to concerning this pilot project scheme. Each pilot project implementer is basically free to describe their practices and products as Japanese style of education, although there's no public consensus on what the Japanese style of education really is. So despite such discursiveness and ambiguity, and whether it's widely practiced in Japan or not, once they're selected, they'll become officially certified EDU-Port supported Japanese style of education and receive various financial and non-financial support from the states. But the grant amount for each project is very small, negligent, and only half of the project actually gets grant. But there are a range of non-financial support from the state, including the support by the Japanese embassy and JICA office in the country that they operate, in facilitating making an appointment with the high-level government officials of their counterpart countries, among others. So this official support and endorsement from the Japanese government seems to have significant for the private businesses and private universities, because it will give them much needed credibility and legitimacy for them to, work in, overseas context. And there are some interesting example. For instance, one Japanese music instrument company and one sports equipment company, they have been trying hard to get their programs adopted in the national curriculum of Vietnam, but they have not been so successful when they're just doing it by themselves. It was just simply impossible to break the bureaucratic red tape in Vietnam. But once they are selected as EDU-Port pilot project and then endorsed by the Japanese government and receive some support from the Japanese embassy, then these companies successfully managed to get their programs adopted in Vietnamese national curriculum. And we could say that this is quite a historic turn in Japan, because Japan and the Ministry of Education in particular has been taking very cautious attitudes towards education interventions in the matters of education of other nations for many years, mainly because of its pre-war history of occupation of neighboring countries in Asia. So how did this unprecedented policy got shaped and budgeted in Japan at the particular time? It's really interesting question. There are a number of global and local forces that seem to have influenced the policy and policy formation processes of EDU-Port, but certainly there has been a growing foreign interest in Japanese education in recent years, including Japanese types of colleges of technology, so called Kosen, and Tokkatsu, which is a multiple non-subject student special activities in school, such as cleaning and lunch duties by students themselves, aiming at developing the whole child. And one such attention came from the Egyptian president El-Sisi, who expressed his willingness to introduce Japanese Tokkatsu in the schools in Egypt, with the expectation that it will contribute to peace, stability, and the prosperity of his nation. And one should know that Egypt at the time was just after the Arab Spring. So it's a good example of how countries try to borrow education from other countries to push their own existing domestic reform agenda. So similar to Finland, Japanese EDU-Port tried capitalizing on this growing international attraction to education model. But there seems to be some differences as well, whereas overseas attraction to Finnish education come mostly from its remarkable performance in OECD PISA, which made Finland as one of the most well-known reference society, I understand. But in the case of Japan, overseas attraction to Japanese education doesn't necessarily come from its performance on PISA alone, but also seems to come from its unique economic and social development trajectories, exemplified by post-war industrialization and rapid economic growth as a non-West nation, and perhaps also like unique social order that we have. However, interestingly, it's the Japanese side which often uses Japan's PISA performance to either indicate the relative superiority of the Japanese education or use it to implicitly legitimize its proactive move to transfer. And in addition, the Japanese education practices, which are often seen unique and distinctive from outside, are often recontextualized and decontextualized by the Japanese actors by using the universalist language of the international large-scale assessment in education, such as PISA. Presumably within a sort of expectation that it would enhance their transferability and universality, and then also probably is an expectation that it's easier that way, to explain what Japanese education is all about to the others, non-Japanese. Okay. But this external attraction to Japanese education alone, however, can't sufficiently explain why Japan, decided to take this proactive move to turn into sort of proactive education transfer. So we need to understand specific national economic and geopolitical context. firstly, the Japanese economy has been going through a long-term economic stagnation after the collapse of the so-called bubble economy in the early 90s. And relatedly, we have been experiencing a dramatic demographic changes. Birth rate has been declining at an alarming rate, and which led to the shrinking of the domestic market, of course. And so many industries in Japan, including edu businesses, started looking for market opportunities outside of Japan, but they have faced intense competitions in a global market. At the same time, many manufacturing industry of Japan, such as automobile and electronics industry, which once sort of contribute to the Japanese miraculous economic growth, have relocated to their production points to other countries in Asia. While we so that sort of necessitates the sort of Japanese types of human capital in foreign countries. And secondly, there was a change in the geopolitical landscape as well. There's a rise of China, which has become major economic and military power in Asia. And at the same time, many Asian countries have also made a steady economic growth, becoming both market opportunities and market competitors for Japan. So against these backdrops, revitalizing Japanese economy and international standing become a key policy agenda of Japan. And in 2012, 4 years before EDU-Port got started, Shinzo Abe, a well-known nationalist, and returned to power for the second time. And then as soon as he returned to power, he started pursuing his proactive economic diplomacy to restore Japanese economic and political power. And one of his flagship initiatives was infrastructure export policy, which tried to sell Japanese infrastructure system, such as highways and airports, to emerging Asian economies through PPPs. And then it was argued that construction and operations of Japanese style infrastructure needs not only the export of the physical equipment, but also uniquely Japanese type of human resources with unique soft skills and set of work values, such as like strict time management and cooperative attitude and so on. And so Abe instructed the relevant ministries to support this policy. And interestingly, so this infrastructure export policy, which is seemingly totally unrelated to education, actually became one of the important policy drivers for the EDU-Port. And in addition, promoting edu businesses overseas also became an important agenda for Japanese government. I've said earlier, Japanese edu businesses have been actively seeking new education market overseas. And but they have faced a fierce competition, especially with the Western English medium edu businesses. And next official, Ministry of Education official, didn't immediately feel that it's their job to promote overseas operation of edu business, because their main job is to really administer the local education affairs. But this, policy environment in Japan, with the strong power centered in the Prime Minister's office, and also some demands directly expressed by the edu businesses themselves, seems to have changed their initial non-committal attitude. So in a way, edu businesses was part of the policy formation process. And meanwhile, it's interesting that the MEXT has closely studied about the national education export strategy of Finland and Singapore. They even sent a delegation to Finland to study its national education export strategy. So we could say that there was some kind of transnational borrowing of the national education export strategy as well. And so this is, I'm almost coming to the end. Okay, so in addition to this economic rationale, there was also strong motivation to use EDU-Port as an important tool for international aid. And indeed, the transfer of Japanese style of education with the strong involvement of private sector was considered as an important Japanese international cooperation in education. And coincidentally, JICA has also actively involving edu businesses in their operations. And this is, some of the background, important background is the declining of ODA budget. And so using aid to serve national interest has become agenda. And at the same time, there has been a call for branding Japanese aid, building upon Japanese unique comparative advantage. And finally, one other motive to initiate EDU-Port seems to come from the perceived need to internationalize Japanese education, and not only to make Japanese education globally competitive, but also nurture sort of Japanese people, Japanese people with the attitude of the global mind and sort of transnational understanding and so forth. Okay, so this is my final slide. And last but not least, I want to mention the important mediating role that was played by the special advisor of the minister, special advisor to the Minister of Education at the time. Being a former METI, Minister of Economy and Trade bureaucrat who turned into politician, having close links with the private edu businesses and education department of OECD, he successfully aligned the divergent and conflict in domestic interests to shape the EDU-Port. At the same time, he strategically mobilized the international policy discourses, not only to legitimize the policy, but also smooth over tensions and contradictions inherent in EDU-Port. So again, these cases suggest that global and national forces cannot be hierarchically positioned, but they are rather closely entangled, and we can't separate them neatly. So that's the end of my presentation, and then over to Keita. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Taeko. Now, having heard Taeko's presentation, it's a bit difficult to talk about ethics, isn't it? Because it sounds to me that the EDU-Port is completely saturated with the geopolitical interest of the big players. So it's kind of difficult to talk about where the hell is actually ethics in this scheme, right? So I'm going to try my best to really try and excavate. Excavate is a term that I want to use quite consciously here. Excavate the good sense in EDU-Port. I'm not making an argument to defend EDU-Port. That's not what I'm trying to do here. But I'm trying to see some element of good sense in EDU-Port so that we can actually release it and amplify it for better causes, right? So that's what I'm going to do. So excavating good sense in EDU-Port towards ethics in international educational development. So ethics, in order to make my argument, I want to draw upon this Japanese scholar, Noriyuki Hashimoto, who's an interesting young scholar who does a lot of philosophical work around ethics in international educational development. So I'm going to draw upon his work, and I'll put him in conversation with other scholars to articulate my notion, heavily drawing upon his work, of course, but particular notion of ethics that I want to operationalize in the rest of the conversation. So Hashimoto argues when a question is raised about the ethicality of international cooperation in education, it creates a self-doubt and hesitation. These are the two terms I want to highlight here. Self-doubt and hesitation in the action of those involved. On the contrary, if international cooperation in education is pursued without any hesitation, their act will become unreflective and unethical. Ethics in international cooperation in education necessarily requires us to doubt and hesitation. That's my emphasis. Before we even think about what we can do for others. EDU-Port Nippon shows no sign of self-doubt, no hesitation. What is visible is promotion only. Now, remember that Taeko was talking about proactive promotion of Japanese style of teaching pedagogy overseas, right? So Hashimoto ends up providing a rather scathing critique of EDU-Port. It's almost dismissive of what EDU-Port tried to do. I'm going to disagree with him in terms of his assessment of EDU-Port, but I do embrace his philosophical take on ethics. So just to spend more time on what Hashimoto is arguing about ethics. He argues that education and development, these two acts necessarily involved normative and value-laden judgment around the question of what is good and what is desirable. You can't escape it. It's because the condition for education, the basic condition for education development, is the asymmetrical relationship. Education and development does not even exist without the presence of asymmetrical relationship. So teachers are empowered to decide upon what students learn or how they should learn. In a similar fashion, aid givers, by and large, in a powerful position to decide how poor countries or developing countries should develop. So it is based upon an asymmetrical relationship. And the danger of that relationship is that it often leads to unilateral imposition of values. What I think is good for you is good for you. There's no questions, hesitations around that. So you end up falsely universalizing your sense of self through others. And that is precisely what cultural imperialism was about, according to Hashimoto. So to practice ethics in education and international development, we need to be highly reflexive and being able to doubt ourselves and exercise reservation and hesitation. So ethics, I'm going to continue with Hashimoto's argument. So conditions for ethics in educational development, two conditions are we should be able to destabilize our sense of self as opposed to unlimited expansion of self or false universalization of self. And we need to be able to recognize negativity in us, in ourselves, through others. And then we're going to put Hashimoto in conversation with Fuyuki Kurosawa, who has published this book called Ethnological Imagination, Cross-Cultural Critique of Modernity. He's a sociologist, but it's an interesting book. He talks about all sorts of different classical sociologists or social thinkers like Durkheim, Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and so forth. A few other people I can't remember. But what he essentially argues in the book is central to the rise of critical thought, social theory, is this intellectual practice of cross-cultural mode of self-critique. That is, those thinkers were engaged in cross-cultural analysis of Western modernity by referring to cultural conditions of other places in the world. So they were constantly mobilizing mythical notion of others in order to be able to raise questions about the Western modernity and try to distance themselves from the norms and conventions of Western modernity. So ethnological imagination allows for the temporal and spatial estrangement, that is making things strange, of self through encounters with others. It allows for detachment of yourself from the here and now. So essentially, ethnological imagination is about self-unlearning. And I think the discussion around ethics developed by Hashimoto relates very much with this notion of ethnological imagination and self-unlearning and detachment and so forth. So I'm going to draw upon these concepts in order to assess to what extent those who are actually involved in EDU-Port actually enacted ethics in the way they talk about EDU-Port. And what I'm trying to do is, despite all the almost depressing picture of EDU-Port, and I agree that EDU-Port is largely dominated by economic political interests, but I'm trying to excavate, I'm trying to dig deep in order to find some good sense in the thing called EDU-Port, right? So first interview, mixed official, ministry official within the international division. So that's the division in charge of the operation of EDU-Port. So he is talking about Mr. K, who was the high-ranked official at the time of the implementation of EDU-Port, who was actually quite instrumental in making EDU-Port possible. So in reference to this guy, this official says the following: I believe that the Mr. K was hoping that EDU-Port would offer a view of Japanese education as seen from abroad. That is, to make visible those practices that had been taken for granted in Japan, including the so-called the strength of Japanese education, which was accepted without evidence. So notice that he is actually envisioning EDU-Port as a form of self-unlearning, learning and unlearning. It's a tool to rethink the Japanese education with. He was also of the view that Japanese education was stuck in the status quo, in that we were not trying anything new and different. So interesting how they see education as a source of new ideas to rethink their own practices and systems. Number two, another mixed international division of his stuff. I think it might have to do with a sense of remorse about cultural imperialism of Japan's past. So he was telling me about why ministry is so, in a sense, very reserved, not aggressive enough about promoting Japanese education overseas, right? So he was trying to explain why. MEX tends to refrain from any attempts to promote strength of Japanese education overseas, let alone anything to do with influencing foreign countries' education through cultural means, though I'm not too sure about politicians. So politicians are quite proactive, but ministry officials are always, we don't want to go there, we don't want to do that, right? What I have always stressed to, again, another official within the international division, what I have always stressed to the EDU-Port grantees, oh, by the way, this guy was actually in the office, directly in charge of EDU-Port when I interviewed him. What I have always stressed to the EDU-Port pilot project grantees is something like education is so deeply entangled with the tradition and the culture of the country. So please don't think that copy and paste of Japanese education will work. This is absolutely crucial. So that's what he was telling to all the grantees of EDU-Port money. I know there were some grantees who simply thought of transplanting Japanese practice as is into other places. But perhaps that is not really what EDU-Port should be about. It is about grasping the essence of Japanese education, which can be applicable to other countries. It is a mistake to think that EDU-Port is about how wonderful and great Japanese education is, unless it helps us understand what it is that makes Japanese education work. The goals of EDU-Port aren't really achieved. Again, the emphasis is on self-learning and unlearning. Interview 4. So this one is the interview with one of the steering committee members who was very instrumental, again, in making EDU-Port possible. But education is a bit different from trains and bullet trains. It is very sensitive, not something to be imposed upon others. And MEX officials do not even think about making money by exporting Japanese education. Whether it is good or bad, they have no idea, not even a taste for business. So they're clueless about making money. Of course, that's not what they're in. And besides, they find a project like EDU-Port troublesome. It costs them too much money and with little return for them. They're not interested in the infrastructure export, while the Prime Minister's Cabinet Office, Ministry of Economy, Trade, Industry are, as Taeko's presentation clearly demonstrated earlier. As I worked at the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, I have the business sense. So I think I can appreciate the both. So he was actually the middle guy. He was actually the one who bridged the gap between ministry and other powerful ministries in order to make EDU-Port possible. But it's quite interesting to see how he talks about ministry, right? So ministry has completely a different set of agenda than other powerful actors. Last person, again, another steering committee member. If I say, because Japanese education is superior, you should do as told, then it is the attitude of cultural imperialism, isn't it? And this is not what EDU-Port is about. When Japanese education gets tried elsewhere, it acts like a mirror where we get to observe what is great in other ways about Japanese education. So seeing others trying Japanese education allows us to rethink what Japanese education is. And I believe this is the aspect of EDU-Port that is most important for MEXT. And it is precisely why I decided to get involved. You notice the strong emphasis on self-unlearning in these comments. And if you look at the promotional videos and exhibitions that they have put up in international world education expos and so forth, so I have only 5 minutes, all right? I'm gonna speak twice faster than I have been, which is impossible. Now, it's interesting, we've spoken to the people who are actually involved in the production of these videos, promotional videos, right? What they emphasize, also the direction that they were getting from ministry, was that make sure that any representation that we're gonna put in these videos has to be average. It has to be about facts. It's not about selling. And if you watch these videos, if you click on this link here, you can watch the video, and it's provided in multiple languages. It's fascinating, especially if you compare this video with the Finnish flashy, highly commercialized video that you guys got. It's such a contrast. But it's about facts, and it's all so ordinary. The title of the video says everything. One day of elementary school students in Japan. Japanese style of education from the viewpoint of teachers. And if you watch this video, any Japanese person will say, well, yeah, that's what we see in any schools that we walk into across this country. There's no spin, no gimmick, and minimum sound and visual effects. And I don't see any branding effort in these videos, unfortunately. And where the hell is a proactive promotion here? So where does this all come from? So this is where my speculation comes in. Tradition is a tradition that needs to be recognized. And I don't think ministry officials understand this tradition quite well. Japan's international development assistance, there's a history. Kenneth King and Kuroda both argued there's something distinctive about Japanese approach to international development assistance. There's a strong focus on self-help. There's a strong respect for recipient countries' ownership and what they call intrinsic characteristics of the country. We're going to respect that. And this term that King uses, we will wait until ownership is in place. So it's a very time-consuming process. And King thinks that that's absolutely admirable. And Kuroda emphasizes that there is an attitude of humility in Japanese approach to international development. Where does this actually come from? It's interesting. Again, speculation. But Sawamura argues, if you trace the history of international development in Japan, it began as part of the post-war reparation for war loss and damages to the neighboring Asian countries. So it's basically sorry money. We did something bad for you. Please accept this money. You can't possibly be arrogant when you're making that sort of offer. And Saito argues that it is a reflection. It's because of the Japanese people's reflection on GHQ, General Headquarters intervention, quite aggressive intervention into Japanese education during the post-war Reconstruction period. So basically saying, well, we don't want to do what Americans did to us. Speculation. But it's interesting, in one way or another, this particular approach to development is a reflection of the Japanese particular history of Japanese education in the post-war period. So now I've talked about the ministry officials and how the notion of ethic was enacted and articulated by ministry officials. So I'm going to bring the discussion down to the people who are on the ground, who actually received the EDU-Port money or certification in order to implement their version of Japanese style of education in different parts of the world, and how the notion of ethics was enacted by or not enacted by these ground level actors. First one, pilot project grantee A, private corporation, profit-making company, tried to implement Japanese education for food or education around food, so-called shokuiku, right? Most clearly exemplified by Japanese lunch duties, right? So he was there in a country in Southeast Asia to promote this particular pedagogical practices and make money, of course. And his reflection was interesting. I have come to realize that Japanese education is the culmination of all the efforts made by generations before us, beginning from the post-war era of material shortages to today. Home economics, school lunch, and national course of study are all nicely integrated around the concept of education for and through food, shokuiku. And I was just struck how remarkable it is to have such a well-developed system. And he goes on to say, I have come to realize that Japanese teachers have the teaching skill sets that are truly, remarkably, the world standard. So if you reflect back upon the notion of ethics that articulated by Hashimoto, you can see how the notion of self is completely bloated. There's a false universalization of self. We know what's best for you, so you take what we offer you as is. Unreserved drive to promote Japanese education globally. So despite all the reservations and doubts and self-doubts expressed by the ministry officials, when the project get down to the ground level, that view, that ethical norms are not quite shared here. Second example, pilot project B, university professor. His mission was to implement and promote Japanese physical education in a country U in Africa. It was interesting. He said that, well, in this country, there's less regulation, a lot more freedom. Kids are just wild. There's a lot more freedom and respect for individuality. And he said African bodies are underdeveloped, needs to be developed. Then he has this unquestioned belief in the superiority of Japanese physical education, right? So you think that, well, this is another example of the false universalization of self. But as we were talking to each other, then I had to push a few questions just to encourage him to reflect a bit more about his own experience. And it was interesting because he shifted in the course of the conversation. He expressed his awareness about Japanese physical education's key features, that is strong body regulations, regimentation, and a collective focus. And then after that, he said, oh, maybe we're doing it too much. Perhaps physical education could be different. And I asked him, how could it be different, do you think? And he started talking about how African teachers were using music in physical education, which is completely unthinkable in a Japanese physical education. And he was amazed how much fun kids are having in moving their bodies with music. So it was interesting because there was an emerging negativity of self in the way he talked about Japanese physical education. Is Japanese physical education excessively controlling? He started wondering, where is fun? Where is the recognition of individual difference in what we do? So although he still believed in the superiority of the Japanese physical education, in the course of the conversation, he started questioning. So self in minor doubt. The last one, destabilized sense of self. Pilot project grantee C, a non-profit organization, they were trying to transfer Japanese community center or Kominkan to country E in Africa. In the course of the project, there was a clear shift in focus. Initially, they were trying to transfer this Japanese best practice to Africa, and then they realized that they're actually trying to reclaim what country E used to have. So all the elders in the country started saying to him that, well, we have something similar in our country long time ago, right? So they discussed, well, we don't necessarily have to borrow what Japan come up with. We have something already. We just have to revitalize what we had before. Time's up. And in the course of the conversation, this guy was very clear about the negativity of Japanese community center. There's all sorts of problems with it. Lack of substance, it's out of touch, and it's continued to be stuck in status quo and so forth. And here's what he said in our conversation, describing a response from a country E, a counterpart to whom this guy had just explained about the declining quality of some of Japanese community center. He said, it is not just a problem for Japan. So the counterpart, he said to him, Egyptian guy, I shouldn't have said Egyptian, but country E in Africa, that's Egypt is the only country that started with E, so it's Egypt. It is not just a problem for Japan. We are looking up to Japan. We want Japan to be an exemplary for other countries. When he told me about all this, I felt like I had my heart shot through. We cannot possibly be slacking off. We cannot possibly be slacking off, when other countries are looking up to Japanese community center. They say, unless you keep up good work, there won't be any that we can use as a model. When I heard him say that, I felt like he had given me some homework to do. I said to myself that Japan must have a hard look at JCC and remodel it in a way that is suitable for the contemporary time. We must let it grow so it can be useful resource for other countries. So what happened in the end in this project was really a collaboration between Japan and Egypt in order to really revitalize what can be called the community center in respective countries. So Japan stopped being the model for Egypt, and it was a completely much more horizontal mutual learning taking place. All right, conclusion. Oh, good. Last slide. So what was I trying to do in this presentation? Is there a Japanese model in international educational development? Is there any evidence of that in EDU-Port? There's a potential in EDU-Port, I think. A potential in the sense that EDU-Port could present as international educational development that includes the educational export as a self-estrangement or self-transformative project, self-unlearning project. But of course, there's a considerable limits as well, as Taeko's presentation clearly demonstrated. How consistently was the ethics promoted by and factored in the design of EDU-Port? In our report, we raise a serious question: to what extent all this rhetoric around doubt, reservations, anti-cultural imperialism, and so forth, all this rhetoric, to what extent those languages are actually reflected in the very design of EDU-Port? We had to raise some hard question. We also have to ask, would strange bedfellow work? The fact that Ministry of Education, that's much more ethically minded in my view, working closely with other powerful ministries in political economic interest, would that going to really work? Ethics in this presentation, the particular articulation of ethics that I presented here is reflective of Japan's particular historical experience. And I think it's an interesting way and a quite generative and productive way of presenting ethics in international development and cooperation. Lastly, I want to talk about the role of researchers. It's easy to critique. Going back to the first slide of the presentation, Hashimoto's sweeping critique of EDU-Port. In his view, there's no ethics in EDU-Port. It's simply about exploitation. But if you start talking to people who are actually directly involved in EDU-Port, you come to realize, no, there's all sorts of different voices and views within the ministry. And there are still good sense shared amongst the ministry officials, and that needs to be recognized. So as a job as a researcher, for me at least, is to excavate and identify, no matter how fleeting that might be, no matter how insignificant and small that might be, and try to excavate the good sense and try to amplify and release the potential. So that's essentially what we try to do in our report. Thanks very much. Sorry for going over time.